Yeah, let's get into it, everybody. We're going to the news notes with, of course, the negative image of Karl Marx and that great comment from Frederick Bastiat. Government is that great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everybody else. Perpetual motion of aggression. Well, here it is. The U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent launched Operation Economic Outcast today. It was the economic D-Day, and he's dropping the bombs on us. I dropped a bomb on you. Calling it the single greatest financial offensive. I think that word is quite appropriate. Ever. Oh, I'm sorry. He added against Iran. Oh, sorry. I mean, it's kind of hard to figure out the targets here. Yeah, so here's DD Geopolitics. We're going to go outside the studios first, and then we're going to go back into our production system and show you what we've been working on here. But here's DD Geopolitics with a little bit of feedback coming from them. They have this quote from Bessent. Trump is making phone calls to world leaders with specific requests to cease their interactions with the Iranian regime. They always have to call it the Iranian regime. Like, Donald Trump is any more authentic a leader over you than any politician, Sorry, they just claim power over you. That's what all states are. Well, this is what DD Geopolitics says. This is what total loss and desperation looks like, folks. Once you start secondary and tertiary sanctions, it's over. Yeah, I think you got to dig this. Oh, my goodness. Here we go. Check it out.
They condone illicit use of their banks, all the while concealing the extent of their complicity. The president is making phone calls to world leaders with specific requests to cease their interactions with the regime. They condone illicit use of their banks, all the while concealing the extent of their complicity. The president is making phone calls to world leaders with specific requests to cease their interactions with the regime.
Okay, so he doesn't like it, evidently, when foreign governments and perhaps their banks or whatever, and we'll focus only on the government right now, the regime, not what they're actually doing, which is applying sanctions on just individuals, just peaceful people who want to engage in trade. It's called trade, free trade. So people are making their own decisions, Scott, without you having to decide for them and point government guns at them. But I think it's rather ironic considering the fact that last week, twice, this guy pulled the rug out from under so many bondholders because he used short-term bonds to try to buy long-term U.S. debt so that the long-term rate wouldn't go up as high, and that would save the federal government some money. So what did that do? That skewed the bond system. But, when it comes to being honest with people, obviously, Mr. Bessent knows best because he worked with George Soros and he was totally clean, just like the Beatles said in Hard Day's Night about, what was it, Paul's uncle or grandfather? You're very clean, aren't you? Yeah, bringing down a government and stuff. But pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Let's continue with the fun. Yeah, all right. Beginning immediately, Treasury is blocking every mapped so-called oil smuggling and sanctions evasion network. Doesn't that sound really scientific? We're mapping every oil smuggling and sanctions evasion network, everybody, so you can feel comfortable when you have your steak dinner. Oh, sorry, forgot that you can't afford steak. As you pretend to have some dinner, as you have your rock soup tonight. Yes, that's right. The U.S. pirates call people wanting to engage in some trade with Iranians oil smugglers and sanctions evasion networks. These would be the United States people who invaded Venezuela to set up deals for Chevron. The United States government that, has been engaging in piracy against oil tankers that went into the North Atlantic. They want a zero leakage approach. Well, I guess you'll have to talk to the people who make Donald Trump's diapers on that one. The new sectoral sanctions were issued today, and they target 5 key lifelines Iran exploits abroad, according to them: digital assets, technology, gold. They want your gold, and they'll start with foreign gold first, just like the Russian oligarchs' yachts under the Biden administration. Those evil people who might have owned some boats, we're going to take their boats, and that'll show how good we are when we steal other people's stuff, and we call them bad guys. Aviation, planes, and shipping. Now, when we're talking aviation, does anybody remember that under one of the Bushes, there was a, you might recall United States taking down an Iranian plane? Maybe that's not a good thing to do, to talk about trying to block Iranian aviation. Might bring back some bad memories. I don't know. Maybe just leaving people alone is something that I'm just not on base here. I'm not aboard their ship. I'm on my own pirate ship. Yes, maybe I'm going to be that pirate. I don't know what my name is. Well, anyway, so here's a little more. They're going to be broadening the sanctions to, of course, secondary and, as we know, tertiary sanctions for any entity or country that continues business with Tehran. And, of course, by Tehran, they mean anybody living in Iran, any human being, and maybe even some dogs. I don't know. Simultaneously, OFAC is designating more than 60 entities, individuals, and vessels linked to nuclear and missile procurement, cyber operations, and oil revenue. In other words, the peaceful nuclear power program that they had, been working on, and they were open to inspections. Missile procurement. Well, missile procurement, they're making their own missiles. And I thought it was okay for nation states to engage in their own defense. Isn't that what the $1.5 trillion of the U.S. military budget is about? Or is that not procurement? I don't know. Then there's the cyber operations, sort of like what Palantir does with Daddy's Home, or, cyber operations like blowing the hands off of kids from Lebanon. And, it's like, but don't forget about that stuff. It's the Iranians. The Iranians are the bad guys. And oil revenue. It's kind of like what they mess with in the United States constantly, to either try to demonize the oil industry or try to make it look like they're friends with the oil industry. It depends who's in office on that particular day. And then we've got, of course, countries have been given defined compliance timelines because, that's the United States. They're other countries. So why not tell them how they should behave? Then, of course, we've got this. Yes, I said the goal is to sever every economic lifeline until the regime stands alone. The volume on the CNBC YouTube video is low, so we can take cuts and amplify them for tonight's Liberty Conspiracy Live. So that's the YouTube CNBC excitement. I know everybody wants some. I want some too. So we're going to go over to that CNBC coverage and check it out for you here. Check it out now, Funk Soul Brother. Got to pull this up here. And this, I think, should be it. Let me just double check here. I think this is it. And bring that volume down here just to make sure. All right. And let's see here. Get my CNBC coverage. Here it is. All right. Yes. Now, he is, as you know, I'm going to warn you before I bring this volume up here. You know how Scott Bessent, the guy's full of fire. So you might want to wear some asbestos or something, because you're just going to get burned by this guy's intensity. Watch out. Here he comes, everybody. Everybody wants some Scott Bessent. It's the Bessent brisket. Here we go.
Today, in that same spirit, we are launching an economic onslaught against Iran's financial connections around the globe. Our objective is to sever every economic lifeline that sustains this tyrannical regime until Tehran stands alone. Iran's fanatics devote themselves to death to America and seek nuclear weapons to do just that.
So, as you know, the death to America thing, as we've been told before, that's a euphemism. And since the United States has been screwing with Iran since 1953, and the Brits were involved years before that, sometimes you might be able to understand why they might mean death to the American regime. You know what I'm saying? Sort of like, if you had some gang of thugs coming in like a mafia telling you stuff, then you might say, hey, piss off, right? Then, of course, there's the whole nuclear weapons lie. So, of course, he's in front of the reporters, and none of the reporters call him out to say, excuse me, hey, Secretary Bessent, why do you keep lying to us like that? They weren't pursuing a nuclear weapon. Why do you keep saying that?
They have murdered and maimed more of our citizens and service members than any other terrorist regime on earth.
They're the terrorist regime. And of course, the United States surrounded them with bases because they're the terrorist regime.
And they have been at war against America, their neighbors in the Gulf, and much of the world for 47 years.
Does anybody see a mirror around? I don't know. I'll stop. I'll just let him finish here.
President Trump has taken action that his predecessors have long deferred. And under his leadership, America is no longer managing the Iranian threat. We are ending it.
Because, there's everything in the Constitution that lets them do all of these things, right? Including kinetic attacks without a declaration. What was that, Russians? No, you're Russians. What are you doing looking at the U.S. Constitution and finding that there's nothing for any of this stuff? Get out. No.
Our great armed forces have laid the groundwork for achieving the president's objective of preventing Iran from ever obtaining nuclear weapons. They have shown America's resolve to finally end this threat. And the strength of America's economy under President Trump allows us to wage this sustained financial operation alongside the might of our military. Iran now faces a very clear choice with only two paths before them: complete global isolation and a subsistence economy, or a path back to normalcy with an opportunity to rejoin the global economy. Today, we are launching Operation Economic Outcast to foreclose every other option available to the Iranian regime.
Well, it really, really is good that they stand against tyranny that way. And by standing against tyranny, I mean pointing government guns at you if you want to engage in, private contracts with anybody from Iran, if you want to actually buy something from Iran, because, by doing that, they're stopping tyranny. See? Totally makes sense. It's a tradition in the United States to make sense like that. Overthrowing Iran, putting in the terrorist Shah, his secret police, the Savat, going around arresting people, torturing people, stuff like that. And then, blaming the Iranians for everything that happens there, because that's Mr. Bessent. There we go. Treasury Secretary Bessent announces Iran sanctions. And I said, notice the claims Bessent makes in the first 3 minutes. Not only is the U.S. economy not strong, any attempt he makes to so-called isolate Iran and others trading with Iranian businesses or with its government will see the U.S. isolate its citizens, not the U.S. harming the foreigners trading with Iran. China's governments already has prohibited their banks in China from complying with any sanctions that Trump tries to place on Iranian exports or trade. They already announced that over a month ago. The Chinese have decreased their holdings of U.S. treasuries, of course, and they can dump more anytime. And then there are the key rare earth minerals that the Chinese provide to U.S. interests. Mario Nafal's got this one. Well, look, one little known metal is becoming a pretty big headache for the U.S. It's tungsten. And the Pentagon wants more of it for weapons and its strategic stockpile, so it can threaten more countries like Iran. And when the U.S. recently went looking, it ran into an awkward problem. There's barely any non-Chinese supplies sitting around to buy. And that's where this gets bigger than weapons. Tungsten is also needed for advanced memory chips used in AI. Two Japanese factories making around a quarter of the world's supply of a key tungsten-based gas shut down in July after their Chinese raw material ran out. Now, Samsung and SK Hynix are scrambling for new suppliers. Meanwhile, China, which restricted those tungsten exports in the first place, is expanding its own production of the gas. So China cuts the raw material, foreign factories shut down, and Chinese factories expand. Pretty convenient. Absolutely right. Then there's this. The U.S. economy is, of course, a mess. And Bessent's attempt to use short-term U.S. bonds to buy long-term bonds last week, thus keeping the long-term rate lower, actually saw no palliative effect for his lovely long-term rates. It did see, however, as we noted, people recognized that the trigger was pulled. It saw people starting to recognize that the U.S. debt is unsustainable, as Muse would say, and the dollar will be devalued even more. This chart tells a great deal. So here it is. Treasuries now offer, and I texted some people about this morning, Treasuries now offer more income than almost every S&P 500 stock. This is from the Kobisi letter. And those of you who were in my text, you saw, like, yeah, thanks, man. Thanks for a wonderful morning. Just about 3% of S&P 500 stocks now have dividend yields higher than the 10-year Treasury note yield. That's a big problem. So, as you know, as I've said before, when we're talking about tariffs, if you've got a strong monetary unit, then you will be buying more products from overseas relative to them buying products from you. It doesn't mean that there's a trade deficit, that somehow everything's got to somehow be equal in the products or services that you're buying. Because the liquidity that goes out, you then have a trade surplus in investment from other countries, as you will see Ron Paul mention in just a moment in our production schedule. So on that level, if you've got a good functioning economy and the GDP is strong and it's a good investment environment, then obviously if your dollars are going out and buying those products from overseas, then the people who get the dollars don't see those dollars magically transmogrify into yen or yuan or pesos or whatever. They sit in their hands and eventually they come back to the United States, oftentimes in investment for liquidity purposes. And as long as there's no artificial competitor, they'll go into businesses that want, money for R&D or to hire some new employees because they're showing I'm a good investment. We are productive. But if you've got a competitor called the U.S. government that has to offer, then we've been talking about this for over a year now. If you've got a competitor that has to offer rates that are extremely high because their debt level is really high, then the ratio of private investment to government pulling that investment is going to dwindle compared to the government. The government is going to suck off a lot of that investment. And that's exactly what's in front of us on the screen, everybody. This is a classroom in itself right here. This is what we've been talking about. This is what Ron Paul talks about. This is what free market Austrian economists talk about. You've got a competitor in the government because the government spends so much for its empire to keep all its little hirelings happy. And it does this by future dating contracts so that future generations become tax slaves, by inflating the currency so that your monetary units are bidding against more monetary units, so their buying power goes down, and by the government now competing against private firms, in example, the S&P 500, to say, oh, no, we'll give you a better rate here. So this is a disaster. This is it. It's coming. Gerald Celente, he's not doomsaying. He's realistic. This is real. It's coming. This marks one of the lowest readings on record in data going back to the early 1970s. This percentage has declined approximately 40 points since the start of 2022. Again, let me repeat, just approximately 3% of S&P 500 stocks now have dividend yields higher than the 10-year Treasury note. That's the 10-year Treasury note, not even the 30-year Treasury note. This percentage has declined approximately 40 points since 2022. By comparison, 63% of S&P 500 stocks had a higher dividend yield than the 10-year Treasury note yield in July of 2016, an all-time high when excluding the 2020 pandemic crash, so-called pandemic. To put this into perspective, the long-term average since the 1970s is 18%. The bond market situation is historic. This is like nothing I've ever seen. This is, when sometimes like you get a really, really intense mint, what do they call the strangely intense mint, and you suck in some air, you're like, whoa, this is like a really cold day. That's what that chart is. That's what this is about. This is craziness. Okay, so let me continue here, one and all. And hello to everybody who might be joining us now. Please share the links if you like what we're doing. We're sounding the alarm. And yeah, it's pretty serious stuff. So I'm trying to be as positive as possible, especially with contributions like that. That was so kind to start things off the show. So good. So again, we'll keep trying to take this approach here in the bunker. Now, ASIN has this. Reporter to Bessent. You said the president is calling world leaders with specific asks. Who is he calling? So here it is. Gee, I feel like Bowser from Sha-Na-Na. Sha-Na, ooh. Here we go. Yep. Bessent. We're not going to name names. Who are you calling?
Thank you, sir. Thank you. You said the president is calling world leaders with specific asks and that there is a defined timeline. Who is he calling and what are the asks?
We're not going to name names. That we've already seen some results, and that I am confident the president, as you all know, is quite persuasive, and we are following his calls up with calls from visits and calls from the State Department and from the U.S. Treasury, expecting them or telling the leaders, the countries, and the entities exactly what we expect and the timelines. And I would expect that very quickly, if they do not respond, then you will see the ramifications of their actions.
Can you say how far the timelines are?
Again, I'm not going to set timelines, but we do not have infinite patience here.
Wow. This is a disaster. This is so much worse than the Biden administration. So much worse. This is absolute gutterball. This is so bad. So inside the news notes, if folks are looking, I've got some remarks from the Treasury. These are the official remarks. I got a Bloomberg piece if you want to find it. But over here, I want to give you this one. U.S. Treasury announces the largest financial attack in history against Iran from Sprinter Press. Now, check out the phrasing here. U.S. Secretary of Treasury announced the launch of a large-scale financial operation against Iran aimed at cutting off Tehran's economic and financial channels. We'll continue a little bit more here, okay? Any countries that provide financial channels to Iran will face increased pressure and economic isolation. Washington warned that continued ties with Tehran will accelerate the isolation of countries and organizations, regardless of whether they were established intentionally or ignored deliberately. Does anybody understand in the White House that this is not going to happen? This is a boomerang. They're only isolating us. That's all they're doing. In the event of Iranian military action against U.S. forces or neighbors in the Persian Gulf, Trump will respond quickly and decisively, the department warned. How? With what? They don't have any fuel. What are they going to do? What's he going to use? Nukes? Meanwhile, Writes Sprinter Press, the Telegraph of London reports that Iran has threatened to attack American companies if Trump launches an economic D-Day campaign to force Tehran to agree to a ceasefire agreement. To be redundant. Yeah, no kidding. And finally, let me give you this from some of these cuts. I've got one more inside our recorded system, but this from Asen, as Bessent is asked a specific question. You described this as an economic D-Day, but D-Day wasn't a threat of an invasion, and the U.S. didn't give a timeline to Germany. So why impose the sanctions today? Bessent, check it out.
Let's see. You in the front.
You described this as an economic D-Day, but D-Day wasn't a threat of an invasion, and the U.S. didn't give a timeline to Germany. So why not impose the sanctions today?
Well, we are giving everyone the opportunity to remedy bad behavior. Why would I want to blow up the global financial system? We believe that it is important to level set and give people a cure period, but they should know that that will move very quickly and that we are serious. Second,
so he's admitting, the guy says, why not do it today? He's admitting it would blow up the global financial system. Bessent doesn't seem to grasp how precarious. I don't even have words for it. This is so bad. This is so disastrous. I've never seen anything like this in my life, ever. Like, I was a little kid during the Ford and Carter administration, and when Nixon went off, the so-called gold standard, which it wasn't really the gold standard, they had long before printed up many more dollars than they could promise ever. They were so badly in fractional reserves that it was ridiculous. This is like nothing I've ever seen for a setup for economic disaster. And they seem to think they can pull this stuff off. So let's go back over here, and I want to show you a couple things. As I noted, last week, Bessent claimed that the U.S. was in good economic shape. He tried to deceive people by implying that the Trump administration brought down the U.S. debt to GDP ratio. Remember when I mentioned this? He tried to imply that under Biden, the U.S. government debt to gross domestic product ratio was worse, when in fact, it's the exact opposite that has occurred. But by the way, this is 21 Wire. Brian McLean did a great job filling in for Patrick Henningsen yesterday. This is the clip that I wanted to show yesterday, and these guys showed it yesterday. Wanted to show last week, and I didn't show this clip of Bessent. These guys did it, and all credit to the Sunday Wire. Great stuff. Noontime Sundays, Eastern Time, U.S.
And Trump speaking gibberish nonsense, like they don't even have the 101 knowledge of American economics. And of course, we've discussed earlier in the show that Hormuz controls the movement of physical commodities, and financial networks control the movement of the money, and the same geopolitical principle applies. So, with that in mind, let's take a quick look at what Secretary of Treasury Bessent said to reporters recently here.
Secretary, yeah, if you could answer facing the cameras, but for the $40 trillion mark that we passed for the national debt, would you comment on that, and how do we reverse that?
Yeah, look, the 40 trillion is a big number. It is smaller when you look at the publicly traded amount because our Social Security funds and other government entities hold a substantial amount. And what we're going to do, we're going to have to grow our way out of this. And as I talked about at G20 in Asheville, we are going to talk about the U.S. growth strategy and encourage the rest of the world to come along with us. We are also, I announced that Director Russ Vought and I have been tasked with looking at fiscal consolidation. I think the numbers are not the actual numbers now. We've had to do substantial tariff refunds due to the court ruling, but with the Section 301 tariffs, I am confident that we will be back to the same level, if not higher, of tariff income for last year, and that is most of the increase in the deficit. And remember, we did not get here in a day. That we were left with a mess. The Biden administration had the highest deficit to GDP in history when we weren't at war or weren't in a recession. For 2025, we brought it down by more than 1%.
All right. So you see how he gave it some couch padding there? Had the highest deficit to GDP ratio when we weren't at war. He puts all these caveats on there. Let me give you the real information, because the instant I heard him say that, I'm like, this guy's trying to deceive people. They keep trying to pat themselves on the back in ways with other people's hands. It's just disgusting. It's disgusting. They're so dishonest. So let me show you this. I swear, all those years I was writing for MRC TV, working as an anarchist libertarian for a paleo-conservative / neoconservative group, but we linked up in areas on economics and stuff like that. And as I said, they would even allow me to argue my argument about the immigration thing. And I even convinced some of the people there about they started to turn to me. Originally, they weren't going to let me write on that stuff. When I would be writing about the Biden administration, it was very easy to be able to look at those guys and say, you know what? These people are just incredibly corrupt, right? Then Trump comes in and they do this. I mean, for Obama, I was writing for Obama. Then Trump comes in and he does the pandemic stuff. And he doesn't stop so much of the corruption. He helps trigger so much of the corruption. He's in favor of the CARES Act and the PPP, corrupt, doesn't stand up for the Bill of Rights as people are having their 5th, 6th, 8th Amendment rights completely destroyed, supposed rights protected by those things. And nobody except essentially me and a few other people on the so-called conservative outlets are writing about this stuff. And actually pointing out Trump being involved with it. So many other people are complaining about it, but it's this sort of amorphous complaint of, well, the government of this state and this state is like, no, the federal government has a responsibility to stop those people from crushing the Bill of Rights, from stopping the governor of California or the mayor of such and such city from shutting down that business or going after the paddle boarder off the coast. These are things that are very, very clear. The CARES Act is unconstitutional. Talk about it. Instead, you get people at like Heritage and stuff sort of fudging it and going along with these things. It's like, no, now it's way past that. It's so bad. It is so bad. So let me give you some of this information. When Biden left office in January of 2025, total gross federal debt was around $36.2 trillion. Total. Using contemporaneous nominal GDP figures, around 29.8 to 30 trillion annualized. The total public debt to GDP ratio stood at approximately 121%. Okay. Now, by the way, I heard some people saying the debt to GDP ratio has gone over 100%. It's been over 100% for years. Larry Johnson's been talking about that. Now, as of August 2026, total public debt recently exceeded $40 trillion, $40.03 trillion as of the 20th. The most recent official Federal Reserve quarterly figure is now 122.6% for just quarter one of 2026. More recent estimates reflecting the higher debt level, including estimates for quarter two, now bring it to between 124 to 126% of GDP. That counters what Mr. Bessent told those reporters standing there like trained seals, accepting the dirty fish that he's throwing to them. I mean, anybody with any common sense could say, wait a minute, excuse me, hold on a second. But then nobody did. Why doesn't somebody, even if you get thrown out, like, why bother being there if you're just going to let it go? Why? I don't understand why people do this. Like, if this is your job and you're going to lie through allowing somebody to say something that's essentially false, why do you do your job? You're just contributing to the lie. It's nuts. It's like being part of the Supreme Soviet. Meanwhile, Iran condemned the measures as economic terrorism and a sign of U.S. desperation after military efforts, of course, failed. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi said they would fail like past sanctions. Supreme National Security Council Secretary Mohsen Rezai warned that continued economic war means, quote, not a single drop of oil will leave the Persian Gulf or Strait of Hormuz, and any country's participation would be treated as an act of war with threats of earthquake-like retaliation. Here is The Guardian, and Anti-War's got great coverage of this as well. Here is the headline: Iran vows to retaliate against countries that cooperate with fresh U.S. sanctions. Well, at least something's fresh out there, not the meat, that's for sure, that Donald Trump's going to be getting from Argentina. So let's talk about a little bit more of this. The economy, war against you, war against foreign people, statism always is war. Bessent baby tantrum, baby blather, absolutely. We've got it right there, right? Absolutely right. Now, Miller. Let's talk about Stephen Miller and his lies. This is quite interesting. This is David Pakman. David Pakman did a very good job, and I'll show you inside my news notes. I gave him some kudos here. Now, Pakman, obviously, a real left-winger, but if we go down to Pakman and what Pakman had to say about Miller, as I noted, and we've got a lot more. We're going to talk about the beef and the beef so-called bailout coming up in a minute, plus some big charts on economics and the oil prices. But let me give you this from Pakman. And where is it? I guess just going to go over it here. All right. Okay. So here is Mr. Pakman, and he did a pretty decent job here. All right. We're going to show Stephen Miller in his weird, almost savant-like style.
On TV and delivered two economic claims that are simply false. But he did something that's very popular in the MAGA right, which is he says things that are untrue with complete confidence, this indignant anger. And it's kind of useful to him because when your audience doesn't know the numbers or have any clue what's going on, you can make up whatever damn story you want. See if you can find the lies in what he says here.
Atlantic, they should all be required to register as a Democrat political action committee. I mean, let's just think through some of the things that you mentioned. President Trump has been in office in his second term for a year and a half and has solved problems that plagued this nation for decades, generations, or even longer. I mean, just go to the foreign policy piece here. He's completely rebalanced our trading relationship with Canada. He has protected American manufacturing and essential supply chains from China. He has completely rebalanced NATO and ensured that other nations pay their fair share. He is now pursuing peace in the Korean Peninsula, which hasn't been achieved since the armistice in the 1950s. President Trump has single-handedly toppled Maduro, freed the people of Venezuela, and secured the greatest boon.
So I just want to pause it. Again, there are very few people who bring this up. And Mr. Pakman doesn't bring up this point. And I just to be fair, I'm going to inject it now, not to really slam Mr. Pakman on this. But when people talk about how Trump has reshaped the United States' relationship with NATO, that's utterly bogus. Again, the United States is not only paying nearly 70%, about 65% of NATO's budget, the U.S. has allotted more money for NATO under Trump. $2 billion more, not less.
America's energy and supply chains probably in the history of our country. He's taken the fight to the drug cartels, declared them a foreign terrorist organization, used military power to fight these enemies of...
Does anybody get a sense of the imperial presidency here with all these things that they're claiming they can do just out of nowhere? Many of these things, even if they were passed by Congress, would be completely unconstitutional.
Civilization. And as you have mentioned, he stopped Iran, the Islamic theocracy of Iran, from obtaining a nuclear weapon that could destroy an entire city.
Barack Obama had the JCPOA. Iran not only was open to inspections to show that it was only a nuclear energy program, they were open to inspections by Americans virtually any time. In fact, they were more open than many countries to inspections for the IAEA. Did Miller mention that? Did Fox News question him on it?
Now you come at home, he's unleashed American energy, he's building pipelines, he's bringing the price of gas down from the heinous highs of the Biden administration, he's taken inflation from the highest level in American history down to 2%.
All right, let's stop there. I want to focus on those last two claims. First of all, the average price of regular gasoline in the United States is over $4 a gallon right now. That's not going down. It's gone up recently. It's up about $1 over a year ago. It's a big increase, and a lot of it is because of Trump's Iran war and the tariffs. Now, it is true that gas briefly went above $5 a gallon in June of 2022. That was because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. There was disruption to global energy markets. That was a global issue. But when Joe Biden left office, regular gas was about $3 a gallon. And then it went up under Donald Trump, especially after Trump launched the war against Iran and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz was disrupted. So Miller wants to compare today's price with the 1 week that gas was really expensive globally during Joe Biden's 4-year presidency. But that ignores how much the price came down, the price that Trump inherited, and then the price went back up. It's like gaining 40 pounds and bragging you still weigh 2 pounds less than the most you've ever weighed. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then inflation. Miller goes, we were taken by Trump from the highest inflation in American history down to 2%. Extraordinarily dishonest. Every part of that is wrong. Now, again, June of 2022, between COVID and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, inflation peaked in the United States and in just about every Western developed democracy. It was really high. It was not the highest in American history. Inflation was above 14% in 1980. During the period around World War I, we had roughly 18% inflation. So 9% is the highest in a while, not in American history. But most importantly, when Biden left office, inflation was 2.9%. And Trump didn't get inflation down to 2%. Trump has seen inflation go up all the way up to 3.8% and more recently around 3.5%. So Miller is, if you pressed him, he might go, well, I'm looking at core inflation, which excludes food and energy or using some different metric. But even that's not 2%. And even that doesn't change the fact that Americans are paying more for gas, more for electricity, more for groceries. This is how the Trump economic propaganda system works. You compare it with a more convenient Trump number, the tragedy, and this is what is just so depressing in this country. A lot of people will hear Miller's claim confidently stated on Fox News, and they will believe Trump inherited record inflation in January of 25. Trump inherited inflation below 3%, and it's now above 3%. Trump inherited gas at $3 a gallon, and now it's above $4 a gallon. When they think their audience is clueless, they will try making it all up. And when they're clueless, now the only think they kind of realize what's going on, and maybe you can bamboozle them a little bit about the trajectory of gas prices over time. But I think that a lot of these voters know, and they're not going to be tricked with this stuff in November. That's what we need to hope for, not because we hope that the country does terribly, but that if the country's not doing well, we hope that voters understand it and vote understanding that when they say, I'm going to vote for more Republicans or I'm going to vote for fewer Republicans. That's the goal for voting, to be responsive to what's going on out there in the streets. Saying everything's awesome didn't work for Biden-Harris in 2024. It just didn't work. People were like, no, we don't believe you that that's what's going on. I don't think it's going to work for MAGA and Republicans either. Now, another broken promise of Trump's is that the national debt is now at $40 trillion. We are going to talk about that on today's bonus show, as well as the Trump administration undoing plans to boost workplace heat protection.
So you can see you've got the workplace heat protections thing. It's the left wing thing, of course, unconstitutional, more expense for the federal government to try to enforce that. What I think is kind of interesting is I'm looking at the background there, and I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Geronimo Stilton books, but I keep thinking, are those Geronimo Stilton books? And those are wonderful little books. The Geronimo Stilton books are actually written by an Italian dude and introduced, I think, Scholastic. Again, Scholastic got the contract for that, just like they got the contract very wisely for the Harry Potter books when other people weren't bidding on it and they grabbed it. So, okay, let me get into this a little bit more for you, everybody, because there are some other items here that I think are important. So let me go with this. The demise. The demise is starting swiftly. So, actually, before I even do that, let me just mention a couple things about Mr. Packman's statements. Inside the news notes, you'll see this. Got a little bit that I want to share with you just briefly. And it's right here. I said I just noted this just to be as fair with the facts as possible. Mr. Packman errs in not mentioning that the fuel supply decrease that occurred when Russia invaded Ukraine came not because of the invasion, but because of U.S. and EU sanctions against Russian fuel. And he neglects to mention that the NATO-U.S. forces encroached into the former Iron Curtain Soviet bloc nations that James Baker promised would not be incorporated into NATO, and that the U.S. overthrew Yanukovych in Ukraine late 2013, early 2014. But his point about the Trump rhetoric points are correct. So then we've got that link there in case you want to actually get to it yourself, everybody in the news notes. If you're one of the genetically superior paid subscribers, that is a link to the actual video of Mr. Packman doing what you just saw. Now, let's talk about the centrally planned oil reserves. The U.S. is down to just 41 days of crude oil, the thinnest cushion it's had in 50 years, says Mario Naffo. So how is Trump going to enforce his wonderful blockade? The reason is not a mystery. Nearly 6 months into the Iran war, the Strait of Hormuz is still effectively shut, choking off up to 1/5 of the world's oil supply. To fill the gap, Trump is what? What's he doing? Yeah, of course. To fill the gap, Trump ordered a massive drawdown of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, roughly 172 million barrels over 120 days. Over 108 million have already gone out the door, dropping the reserve below 300 million barrels for the first time since 1983. There's the chart for you. That's kind of bad. Sorry to give you all the bad news there, right? Okay. Now let's get to some of the other statements by some of the people who think that they're pretty sharp. Donald Trump and Stephen Miller and Scott Bessent seem to be of the mind that the U.S. economy is doing great. Again, just to reiterate, there's the Strategic Petroleum Reserve information from Stephen Ratner, a left-winger, right? Okay. Well, there's this. When a nation state controls the money supply or creates a proxy to do it, as is the case of the Federal Reserve, the money creation spigot pours cash into the cronies, seeing their margins increase, even as the money supply eventually bids up prices for the average consumer. Stephen Ratner, again, is a lefty, and his answers don't see an end to the central bank or the monopoly of power claimed by the central government. But his observation right here is worthwhile. So Ratner writes, and again, this might sound like it's coming from a left-wing point of view because it is from him, but he makes the point, and it contributes to that sense of anti-corporate, anti-fascist sentiment that people are feeling now, which is combining with the anti-warfare sentiment and now mixing with a lot of people who call themselves social democrats and who want larger government welfare programs domestically and think that that's a counter to years of exploitation and just this kind of thing right here. Wages grew in step with the stock market for the first decades of the post-war boom, writes Steve Ratner. Since Reagan, stocks have skyrocketed while wages stayed on the same trajectory, up 9,686% versus up 1,196%. That gap is a big driver of, as he calls it, inequality, and a case for taxing capital more like work. Now, again, it's very important to put in some caveats here, okay? Because again, we're talking about time periods here when we're just talking about wages for the employed. So as I mentioned about Stephen Moore's claim that people were having an easier time for their affordability, I said that excluded from the data set unemployed people. So you can't even claim it's a valid study because unemployed people obviously aren't affording things very well. Well, there are going to be periods here within this chart that we see that people will look at this and will say, well, what about unemployment and so on and so forth? Okay. But this chart does lend a lot of grist to the mill for the anti-corporate types of people. The other factor is, what about the other direction? What about time periods of very high employment? So you could have a time period where wages aren't increasing that much, comparatively speaking, because employment has increased dramatically. So there are all sorts of variations within this, and you'd have to spend time with the class for a couple of weeks trying to come up with different ideas on, okay, what are we missing? Can I get this information from like the St. Louis Fed or whatever, right? So this, but I wanted to give this to you because look at this. Stocks versus wages. There's the S&P in the red and the wages in the dark blue, the navy blue. It's just amazing. Absolutely amazing. Now, why could that be happening? Again, because as I mentioned in the preview, in my written preview, mostly the reason is because you've got a central bank and it's got crony friends that are investing in the stock market, and it's become a casino. Now, as I noted, and David Knight brought this up today, Ray Dalio outlined in his book, How Countries Go Broke, The Big Cycle. And there's a link to it inside the news notes. This is from Thrift Books. You can get it it's $50, but you can get it. Okay. So Ray Dalio, to paraphrase Hemingway, he said that countries go broke gradually, then suddenly. And of course, we've been watching the gradual each time the US or any other government body claims your decision-making power isn't your own. That's the war on you. That's the state. And that comes to defining your own safety, your own security. Now, Ray Dalio estimates U.S. government's revenue at about $5.5 trillion this year against $7.5 trillion in spending. That leaves approximately $2 trillion in shortfall. Interest rate costs alone will be about $1 trillion this year, while about $10 trillion worth of debt needs to be refinanced. Without a change in course, a U.S. debt crisis could arrive in 3 years, he said. I think it's coming sooner. Now, Dalio advocates for reducing the budget deficit to 3% of GDP from the current level of about 6%. That's the deficit, not the debt. Not debt to GDP, but deficit to GDP. From about the current level of 6% through a combination of spending cuts, higher tax revenue, and lower interest rates. He said similar fiscal constraints are confronting countries including the UK, China, and Japan. Again, we are looking at a global currency crisis and a global depression. And Trump is doing everything he can to exacerbate and accelerate it. Meanwhile, gold jumped to its highest since May on Friday, while Bitcoin surged to over 77,000, heading for its biggest weekly rally since 2023. Now, Trump has added 1/3, actually it's 30%, a third of the U.S. government debt of all of that 40 trillion of cumulative debt over the last 250 years. He has contributed to a third. Here's the way to look at the 250-year celebration. Trump has made Americans debtors again. And he's done it by adding 30% to the debt over the last 250 years He's done it under Donald Trump. So let's go to Ray Dalio now. This actually recorded from David's show a little bit earlier today. Again, starting swiftly, it's starting.
How are we going to solve this problem? We're going to do it the way that we always do it, and it's always done when countries essentially go broke. What they do is they, through a combination of devaluing the currency, printing of money, there's an imbalance. They print money, devalue the currency, and create an artificially low interest rate so that the person who's holding the bonds is receiving an artificially low interest rate. That's the way Japan has done it and with their local, and that's the way we will do it.
So in other words, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren not yet born are going to be paying off this debt in devalued dollars, more or less.
It's going to happen faster than that.
Faster than that.
That's right. Exactly. It's going to happen faster than that. It's going to happen a lot faster than that, for God's sake. Meanwhile, you got numbskulls like this guy. This is also from David's show.
Tremendous growth. And the way you take care of debt is with growth. And we have tremendous growth. We've never had growth like we have right now.
Again, how are you going to get growth if you've got a magnet called the U.S. debt that's pulling the liquidity in, as I've said over and over and over again in classes and here, everywhere? Everybody who understands fundamental economics and the balance of trade knows that you can't have a magnet called the federal government drawing away the usable liquidity that normally would go into helping those businesses frigging grow, Donald. And you know how you can stop your debt? By stopping killing people and sending weapons to a genocide machine. By stopping invading Venezuela and intercepting oil tankers, by allowing cheaper, less expensive fuel rather than increasing costs, by decreasing tariffs, not increasing tariffs. Every one of those steps makes investment in an American business more friggin' attractive. But you don't get it because you have no concept about economics. Because you don't understand ethics. Just leave people alone. For goodness sake, what an absolute disaster. This is so atrociously bad. Now, some great thoughts here. As we move from this over into the tariff disaster, let's start talking about beef and other things. Canada, for example. Let me give you some of the information on the beef story. And we're going to hear from Ron Paul and Daniel McAdams. And if I've missed any comments, we're going to get ready to load up comments over at Rumble. Feel free to drop your comments in. Let's get into a couple other things. First of all, we talked about the debt to GDP. And let's talk about the Strait. As Anti-War notes, and don't forget they're doing their fundraiser there. If I can convince one or two people, think about contributing to Anti-War. You click on any of the stories, you'll see the little link there. Here it is. U.S. claimed 40 tankers exited the Strait in a single day. Of course, tracking recorded 0. Kyle Anzalone wrote this one up yesterday on Sunday. U.S. officials said the U.S. successfully helped 40 vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. Axios' Barak Ravid reported speaking with 3 U.S. officials who said that dozens of tankers carrying 16 million barrels of oil safely exited the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. official speaking with Ravid said the oil left the waterway through the southern corridor. Last week, Axios reported speaking with 2 U.S. officials who explained that over the past several weeks, the military has helped 50 to 20 vessels per day enter or exit the Persian Gulf by transiting the Strait of Hormuz near the Omani coast. Well, unfortunately, responsible statecraft Vice President Trita Parsi argued Iran is likely to escalate the conflict. And as you know, that's right, there is no record of any tankers going through during that time period, carrying their 16 million barrels of magic fairy dust. Interesting. An international shipping agency did not record a single vessel exiting the waterway. But, you know, and you probably have seen that around. Let's talk now about the exit of beef and the beef market. Last week, we talked about Tyson Tyson, of course, shutting down multiple plants, nearly 3,000 employees, because they didn't have a good supply of beef. It was becoming too expensive to operate. They shut them down. Now, people are talking about what's the reason for that. I saw a very interesting short video on YouTube. People were like, "Well, there was a disastrous drought and so on and so forth." She never brought up the problem of expensive feed. So, since I've been working on that stuff for years, ever since the Bush administration forced ethanol into higher percentage into gasoline tanks, thus utilizing more field space for corn and raising the price of corn, I thought, maybe I'll keep track of this sort of stuff. So here's the story. This one, the link right here from MSN Money. President Trump announces plan to lower beef prices. Isn't this wonderful? This is going to be a real thriller, everybody. It's like Michael Jackson before he started looking kind of weird. We're going to go to Washington now, and here it is.
A new push by the Trump administration to curb inflation at the grocery store by lowering beef prices. Eamon Javers joins us. He has the story for us. Eamon.
Yeah, good morning, David. President Trump is turning his attention to rising costs for voters today, announcing what he calls a deal to substantially lower the price of ground beef for working American families. The president said on social media that the U.S. will allow up to 300,000 metric tons of product for ground beef to be imported with no out-of-quota tariff. And he said that we have a commitment that this beef will be sold at 25% below current market prices.
Okay, so isn't that wonderful? They get to decide for you. Now, imagine if there was a big burly federal guard at your grocery store. And every time you went in, he said, okay, today I'll let you go in and get this stuff. Within a number of days, I'm not going to let you do it anymore. That's what they're doing. This is not peace. This is not freedom. This is not choice. And it raises people's prices. Now, they've already done this to fertilizer. They've already done it to the fuel needed to make things like bentonite clay, because it has to be heated to a very high level to make bentonite clay. So they use natural gas. So Biden started doing that because he wanted to push all that green nonsense. Trump did it as well. And of course, they ostensibly do it so they can punish Russia. Got to stop those evil Russians. I keep thinking of Sting, if the Russians love their children too, right? Well, let me give you this. As we noted, Trump announced Friday that he will allow the importation of 300 metric tons of beef without a tariff, implicitly admitting that tariffs increase costs for consumers. Duh. This is a temporary 90-day easing of out-of-quota tariffs on the imported product for ground beef, aiming to lower consumer prices amid record high beef costs and the smallest U.S. cattle herd in roughly 75 years. Now, why? Why would there be such a small U.S. cattle herd? I wonder. The plan, and don't forget, almost 2 weeks ago, the head of the USDA was saying, we're going to make sure that foreign cattle isn't brought in here because we can't have that foreign cattle. Now, Trump is literally saying for 90 days, we're going to allow the foreign cattle to come in, but it's got to come in from a specific country like, Malaysia, Argentina. I don't know why. I don't know. Maybe it's like, favoritism, cronyism. The plan would allow the beef, primarily lean trimmings used for grinding, to enter duty-free beyond standard tariff rate quotas, with a claimed commitment from foreign exporters that it would be sold at 25% below the then current market price of about $6.89 per pound of ground beef. A White House official indicated an executive order would formalize this within 2 weeks. Did you know that the executive branch can just do that? Neither did I. A White House official, either way, it's supposed to be Congress, tariffs, that's all. I didn't know quotas were in there either. It's tariff, that's all. I don't see any quota power in the U.S. Constitution. And by the way, I don't see any power for anybody to write a constitution and force it on me. Do you? I know it's not Halloween yet, but perhaps we can pull the mask off of some of this nonsense. Scooby-Doo. Yes, so a White House official indicated an executive order would formalize this within 2 weeks. Specific source countries were not named in the announcement, although major suppliers historically include Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, Uruguay, and in prior expanded quotas, Argentina. It does look like it's going to be Argentina. Canada and Mexico already face limited barriers under existing trade agreements, which is interesting when we think about Donald Trump now pushing for 50% tariffs on a bunch of Canadian goods, because these are goods that, again, Donald Trump is unconstitutionally engaging in this, and under the U.S., Mexico, Canadian, not even the most favored nation trading status, but under the USMCA, or MCA, they're not supposed to have these sorts of tariffs on stuff, but he's finding these exceptions. So, hockey sticks, that sort of stuff. It's just so dumb. So here's a little link to this. You can see Reuters with the story. Trump to temporarily ease U.S. beef tariffs, irking cattle producers. Now, why would it irk cattle producers? The measure responds to elevated retail prices. Ground beef up roughly 9% year over year in July data, and substantially higher since early 2025, driven by tight domestic supplies after high input costs for feed, as I noted, due to U.S. sanctions over foreign fuel to grow and harvest the feed. Duh. The administration framed it as short-term relief. See, a lot of people are like, well, how can it? This is the thing. Markets respond. Markets respond to these things. So if there's a higher input cost for, say, creating the feed to make the beef, then the beef's going to be more expensive, obviously. American ranchers and industry groups reacted with sharp criticism, viewing the imports as direct competition that undercuts their prices and discourages herd expansion just when high cattle values should incentivize retaining heifers. Now, again, for the free market interest people, they might say, but Guard, wouldn't it be good to allow these products in and allow for competition? Absolutely, that'd be great. But what they're not discussing is that what Trump has done has been to point a government gun at these people. And now he's removing the government. This is the foreigners. Now he's removing the government gun for a short period of time to let them do this. Meanwhile, he has not lifted the expensive burdens that have caused the domestic suppliers such headaches, like on foreign fuel. And he's demanding more fuel for his war. So, oh man, it's so corrupt. It's so bad. The National Cattlemen's Beef Association called flooding the market with below market foreign beef not the way to rebuild the American cattle herd, arguing that it sacrifices long-term stability for short-term messaging and could worsen profitability. The U.S. Cattlemen's Association and individual producers described it as a betrayal or slap in the face, warning that it weakens domestic markets during a critical recovery period. Cattle futures dropped after the news. Republican senators from cattle states, including those from Nebraska and Montana, publicly expressed disappointment, stressing that lower grocery prices should not come at the expense of U.S. producers. So you can bet they're going to be lobbying for bailouts for their local ranchers. Some people might think that mentioning their criticism buys into some non-free market thinking, but the mixture is complex. So there's more from the Financial Times. So betrayed. U.S. ranchers lash out at Donald Trump. So I'm not going to go with the cookie stuff. Just want to show you the headline. Now, ranchers have faced sustained pressure. So this is some of the context here. They've faced pressure from rising production costs, cattle feed represents a major expense, often 60% or more of finishing costs. Producer price index data for feed indicated an estimated 3.4% increase in 2026 from the prior year, influenced by soybean, fertilizer, energy, and transportation pressures. Some 2025 analyses of specific components like corn, soybean meal, and alfalfa showed double-digit year-over-year rises in the 10 to 13% range amid drought and, of course, these global factors. These elevated costs, combined with earlier drought-driven shortages, have made operations harder to sustain even as cattle prices rose. Trump's broader tariffs and trade tensions, particularly with China, compounded export challenges. Now, so again, here's the thing. If you've got a shortage of a product, what does supply do? Okay, so you got a shortage. What does the shortage tell? What do consumers express when there's a shortage? There's a higher price, right? What does that price signal suppliers? Bring more stuff in. What has Trump been preventing? More fuel, lower price feed, and more cattle coming in from other countries so that you could afford more. What has he just tacitly admitted? My policies have harmed consumers. I'm going to give a 90-day reprieve on those policies, but not on the blockages of Russian energy so that the domestic ranchers can get their fertilizer or feed for less. No, we're not going to do that. In fact, we're going to draw out more energy, more fuel to attack Iran. And we're going to shut down even more energy supplies because we're going to shut down Iranian oil exports to secondary and tertiary parties. That's what he's doing to domestic suppliers. So this is a little window right now. If you got a big freezer, you might want to buy as much as you can. Who knows where it's coming from? And it's not really going to be that stuff anyway. It's going to be mostly for ground beef, like stuff for dog food. Now, what about the loss of ranchers since 2025? Well, here's the deal. Let me just give you this. Trump's broader tariffs and trade tensions, particularly with China, compounded export challenges. U.S. beef exports to China fell sharply from peaks near 1.7 to 2 billion earlier in the decade to around $500 million in 2025. Look at that drop. That was because China found alternatives, like going to Venezuela, going to Argentina, talking to people in Colombia. Due to retaliatory measures, China went to other exporters. This drop from U.S. demand accounted for demand by China, accounted for a large share of overall U.S. beef export declines that year, removing a key high-value market and adding economic strain for producers. So what happened? Well, what about the loss of ranchers in 2025? Let's explore it more deeply. Well, if we go back to 2020, precise public figures isolating bankruptcies solely among independent cattle ranchers that I looked up today since Trump's January 2025 return are actually limited. So what you got to do is you have to look at broad Chapter 12 family farm bankruptcies, which includes significant numbers of beef cattle operations, but the proportion I don't know. They rose to 315 in 2025, a 46% increase from 216 in 2024. Earlier years showed approximately 560 in 2020, 276 in 2021, 169 in 2022, 139 in 2023, and 216 in 2024, with partial 2026 data continuing elevated levels relative to the early 2020s trough. Now, again, this is all within context, of course, because the number from which you're starting is actually going to be lower in many cases, because you might not see a replenishment of new startups or anything like that. So you'd have to find out what the start numbers were and then work from those things to try to find out what the ratio was of losses for that year, for the ones that actually still existed. So I said, remember, FSA-related farm bankruptcies rose 46% in 2025. Okay. From a free market perspective, as I said, the arrangement itself invites pointed criticism. Trump secured the 25% price cut from foreign sellers essentially by leveraging the threat of or temporary relief from the higher out of quota tariff, the very punitive barrier his administration and predecessors maintained. This isn't free trade. It is managed, coercive deal making in which government power extracts a discount that private buyers could not reliably obtain through ordinary market negotiation. Foreign exporters accept lower margins in exchange for volume access that the tariff would otherwise block. U.S. ranchers, by contrast, face rigid cost structures: feed, land, labor, veterinary care. Labor, by the way, also very important because he's removed a lot of foreign migrants. Regulatory compliance and capital. They cannot be magically reduced by presidential fiat. Feed costs alone have risen in recent years. Producer price index estimates around 3.4% higher, as I said, in 2026, with earlier component increases of 10 to 13% for corn, soybean meal, and alfalfa, leaving domestic producers unable to match an artificially discounted import price. The product type intensifies the competitive pressure. Lean trimmings for ground beef flow heavily into high-volume industrial channels, including the processors that supply fast food chains. Critics have noted the scale, equivalent to billions of quarter-pound patties, and question whether the discounted volume functions in practice as relief for major restaurant buyers squeezed by elevated beef costs. Yes, it does. In a free market, competition is welcome when it reflects genuine comparative advantage and cost efficiency. Here, the imports arrive under a government-engineered price commitment, competing directly against domestic cattle that can't shed costs at will. This tilts the field against U.S. ranchers precisely in the commodity segment where scale buyers operate without addressing the underlying supply constraints of a multi-year herd rebuild. They can't even do something that seems to be good for consumers without, upon further reflection, you realizing, or anyone realizing, it's a really slippery corporate subsidy. I said, I want to reiterate that Trump's 2025 tariffs, particularly against China, had already compounded export challenges. U.S. beef exports to China fell sharply from the peak near 1.7 to 2 billion earlier in the decade to around 500 million last year, due to the retaliatory measures from China and the expired plant registrations. Amazing. And by the way, if the United States is going to sanction secondary partners for Iran's fuel exports, again, what is that going to do to China? And what will China do to the United States? Check this out. Victorious has this. You can literally Google Iran's main trading partners, and China accounts for 80 to 90% of sanctioned oil exports. So someone asked whether or not they're going to go after China. Interesting. A reporter notes that Bessent is talking a big game, but still exempting China from any consequences. Interesting. You mean this might just all be for show before the election? Yeah.
David from Reuters.
Hi, thanks, Secretary. One of the most powerful tools you have at your disposal is the ability to impose secondary sanctions on banks and financial institutions that facilitate transactions for Iran. Chinese banks have often been talked about being targeted, but we don't see any of those institutions targeted here. Is that something that is coming in this campaign, or is the very delicate trade truce with China something that could prohibit you from going that far and taking that very big step?
We want to make clear here today that no one is above the reach of U.S. sanctions. that if they facilitate transactions and are part of the ecosystem that turns Iranian oil into money, into repression, they will be targeted. We find that the best way to engage with countries is through quiet diplomacy, and we are level setting with every country to tell them our expectations. We know who they are, they know who they are, so when the hammer of U.S. Treasury actions falls upon them, they will have no one to blame but themselves.
It's interesting that Mr. Bessent should be talking about tyranny and things like that when in the very statement he's saying, he's talking about using your money that is forcibly taken from you and indebting people who haven't even been born yet and will be forced to pay for all of these adventures to block peaceful trade. That's amazing. I noticed inside Rumble chat, I believe it was Angelo is mentioning it's $5.50 per gallon in West Virginia, I believe, for diesel. And yeah, Thomas Smith said I paid $5 a gallon for diesel today. What the heck, man? Wow. North American House Hippo says, I wonder if Trump has ever eaten at the Mighty Taco chain up in Buffalo, New York. Man, I could go for one of those right now. A little fish taco, too. That'll be epic. Fish taco. I had my first fish taco when I was in Texas. Oh, man, that was good. That was good. Austin, Texas. Good stuff. Now, I want to give you this chart. This is a powerful one. As Unusual Whales has, this Congress has dramatically worsened America's fiscal trajectory, per Bloomberg. This is Congress, the federal debt held by the public as a percentage of GDP. There you go. From the Congressional Budget Office. That is unbelievably scary. That's amazing. It's projected to be over 160, nearly 170% by 2050, according to that chart. Now, finally, I want to give you a little bit to close things off. I want to show you that at the bottom of the news notes, when we talk about these sanctions, I want to get back into the definitions and statements of these things. And not only their ridiculous rhetoric about the evil Iranian regime, but also I want to talk to you a little bit about the UN sanctions. I've got a special report that concludes the news notes, concluding information with his sanctions against Iran, so-called sanctions. Find that in your lovely constitution there, Mr. Rubio. Trump defies UN rules that the U.S. helped create. So you see, Craig Mockbar says, the U.S. announcement of further unilateral sanctions against Iran is yet another blatant act of lawlessness by the Trump administration. These unilateral sanctions are a direct breach of the UN Charter, the rules of sovereignty and non-interference, human rights, and so on. I won't click through on that yet. So I want to give you a little bit of information, and I'm going to round off the show at the end of the night with this. As I noted, several UN instruments and General Assembly resolutions contain language that aligns with Craig Mockbar's characterization of unilateral sanctions as conflicting with the UN Charter, with sovereignty and non-interference principles and human rights norms. These include fundamental charter principles, the 1970 Friendly Relations Declaration, and repeated General Assembly resolutions on unilateral coercive measures, UCMs, the UN term for unilateral economic sanctions or similar pressure. Note that the General Assembly resolutions express the positions of voting majorities and are not binding treaty obligations in the same way as the Charter itself or Security Council decisions under Charter version 7. The legality of unilateral sanctions remains contested in state practice and scholarship. So there's a lot to go through. I found a number of these. As I noted here, sanctions authorized by the Security Council under Chapter 7, especially Article 41, which explicitly contemplates interruption of economic relations, are a recognized collective mechanism, but unilateral measures lack that authorization. So Trump clearly is going against the spirit, if not numerous resolutions within the United Nations that the United States helped create, regardless of what people think of the United Nations. This is something.